Welcome to Prodo's Housing Hive. My name's Jacob from Prodo. I've been knocking around for a good few years at Prodo now, but worked really closely with a large number of our clients across the last few years. But yeah, if you aren't familiar with us, we're effectively a digital transformation partner for the housing sector, and we've been working with providers large and small for over 25 years, primarily on self-service platforms, on web development, strategic consultancy, but always sort of focused on improving both resident experience, operational efficiency, but also sort of regulation readiness more so these days as well. Now, we do believe that digital alone isn't the answer to lots of the challenges in the space. It's about having the right culture, data, systems, and a place to create meaningful change, and sort of all of these things feeding into one, which is the sole reason why we host this Housing Hive. It's not necessarily a product pitch for us or for us to come at you guys with any solutions. It's more of us sort of leveraging our space in the sector to bring people together to talk honestly about the challenges across the sector and opportunities that we're all sort of navigating through. And few, I would say, obviously there is a number of them, but few are getting more focused right now than regulatory changes and regulatory regime around particularly consumer standards and also Awab's law, which is actually our next session next month. But yeah, on to today's session then. So we are a year in now from the introduction of the updated standards, and since around April this year, the first wave of inspections have been taking place under the regulator's new framework. We've seen since that time updated guidance. I think the regulators adjusted certain parts of the approach themselves. We've seen renewed emphasis on board level responsibilities and a bit of a shift in the tone across the space as well, from compliance as a task more so to governance and assurance as a bit of an ongoing responsibility. So we're going to be looking into some learnings from the first few batches, the first year of gradings from the regulator. But just to start with, we participated ourselves in the recent talk on this from Campbell Tickell and Kate Dodsworth from the regulator a few weeks ago. And I think some key themes that came from that discussion was around that, you know, we're a year in, there was at the time, I think a few more since, but around 68 to 70 gradings completed, which obviously is quite a small sample size. So we can't read too much into the insight from the current sort of themes, but there are some definitely emerging. There's, of course, been a number of C1 gradings, but there's obviously been a number of C3s as well. But I think from the data so far, we can see the majority sort of in the middle bracket of sort of C2. What we can see from those findings is that, and again, it is a small sample size, so we can't read too much into this at this stage, but what we're seeing is that local authorities, providers with a majority holding in London, and providers with a higher proportion of stock as flats are, at the moment, less likely from what we can see to achieve that C1. The regulator's quite clear in that they see those who've spent time upfront on self-assessments, on mock inspections, are not only probably more likely to achieve higher gradings because they'll be more informed, but if not, it's one of those that those organisations will importantly be able to demonstrate action plans to improve that grading with frequent contact with the regulator themselves, obviously seen as a positive by them. The RPs that are willing to make the honest and, I guess in some cases, quite difficult decisions around transparency, but also making actual change, is obviously also seen as a positive, as well as boards who are able to demonstrate accountability as well. Some of the data from that session was around that 75% of landlords thus far have completed some kind of self-assessment first. A much lower percentage of those were actually sort of felt ready for inspection. I think it was around 11%. And around a quarter of those admitted that they were still trying to understand what actually sort of good looks like in terms of the results and sort of gradings. And some of the things that have been feeding into the gradings that are less than C1 so far are quite unsurprising, really, when you consider the CSM results around repairs and maintenance, around health and safety. So very sort of asset and stock related issues. But I think what was loud and clear from the regulator on that session and sort of in communications that they've sort of put external since and before that as well is that they kind of see the C1 as a bare minimum, effectively, rather than something which is particularly impressive from their perspective, which I think is quite an interesting point to discuss, certainly with the panelists today. So yeah, I think it's clear that the frameworks are in place. Many organisations are still working out how to interpret them best, and I think people are sort of learning from peers and sort of sharing learnings across the space. Certainly in this sort of face of operational pressures, legacy issues going back, and also sort of cultural shifts, which obviously take time to sort of make impact. So we'll focus today on what that sort of first wave has taught us, some learnings, but also how different types of providers are sort of approaching the challenge. And to help us do that, obviously we've sort of got our own views at Prodo, having been involved in sort of consultancy and strategic sort of support around this topic, but we have panelists with us today, equally valuable perspectives with David Ripley from Stonewater, who's obviously sort of spent some time in the past at 13 Group as well, but also Grant Kennelly from Birmingham City Council. So yeah, I wouldn't mind. It'd be great, you guys, if you could introduce yourselves. If we could start with yourself, David, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. Great to be with everyone this morning. Looking forward to the discussion. So I've just recently joined Stonewater about a month ago, following time at 13 where we'd had 8 years there, and we've been through our consumer grades. Fortunate enough to come out the other side with a C1 on that process, and I'll share some of the insights and some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that we went through on that journey.
Yep. Morning all, I'm Grant Kennelly. I'm a Senior Housing Modernisation and Strategy Manager at Birmingham. So I work alongside another manager on our kind of reg compliance piece. My area is generally more to do with our relationship with the Housing Ombudsman, the CSMs, those kind of things. But we also share the kind of responsibility for our task and finish groups around the consumer standards.
Great stuff. Thanks for that, guys. So yeah, obviously quite different perspectives, and I suppose interested insights from both of you on today's session. So thanks again for taking the time to join us as well. We will keep today's session as quite sort of roundtable, discussion based, kind of conversational, but we will obviously open it up for questions from you guys sort of in attendance today as well. So if you do have any that you'd like to sort of pose to us, please feel free to use the chat as we go, and we'll look to address those when we get some time towards the end, and even sort of address them sort of partway through if it sort of fits. But yeah, it's one of those with, I suppose, a number of questions really, and a number of talking points with us being a year in. But obviously, both of you guys will probably have had different experiences around preparation. But David, with yourself being through the process with 13 already, having sort of got to that C1 grade, and now obviously sort of working through that with Stonewater as well, I wondered if you wouldn't mind starting for us on sort of what the preparations look like. And I know when we discussed this, we kind of talked about that this kind of regime, whilst seen as new to many, maybe sort of is quite aligned to sort of previous regulation in the past. I wonder if we could start there, if that's okay with yourself.
Yeah, no, that's fine, Jacob. I think that is a challenge for the sector, and the way that some of the language that we've used around consumer regulation is built up this massive creature and this massive entity, if you like, where there's a bit of a fear of the unknown. And I think when you look back, if you go back to the previous regulatory regime under the Homes and Communities Agency, weirdly we had four standards. They weren't called consumer standards, but there was 4 standards, and you had within it tenant involvement and empowerment, the home, tenancy, neighbourhood, and community. Now, at a very high level, 2 of those names are exactly the same as they are today. But essentially, when you look at the criteria that's in there, there's probably about 85% of them is exactly the same as the old regulatory framework. I think you can go even further back, and I have the fortunate or unfortunate guise of this to what were the key lines of inquiry and the Audit Commission inspections that we used to go through in the early 90s. And actually, the process that we are looking at now is very much taking us back, I feel, to that, in that kind of tell me and then show me manner. And that is ultimately what I think a lot of us that are going through this really need to think through and understand, that actually a lot of this isn't new. It's badged up as being new, but it's actually quite a tried and tested path. And actually, if we've got that information and we've got that ability to show, then that's great. If we haven't, as you kind of touched on, Jacob, in your intro, it's, and what are you doing about it? And I think having that close to the forefront of everyone's mind as we think about the regulatory inspection is vital for everyone.
Absolutely. Would you say then, David, that when it came to your preparations for both 13 but also your involvement in Stonewater since you've joined, was your preparation kind of informed by those historical or sort of previous sort of regulations? Because it does relate so similar to the consumer standards.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say it was, Jacob. I think the thing I would also say about preparation is that you can't prepare when you get your notice for inspection. I think that's what everyone has to think through, is that the preparation is a daily, weekly, monthly, annual thing that should be happening no matter what you're doing in your organisation. And one of the things that we did at 13 and in Stonewater, I've had a similar approach, is to have that self-assessment and ultimately no one can be more critical than yourself in some instances, and really sort of look into that. But I think if organisations and people are kind of waiting till they get that notice to start their preparation for the inspection, that's where I think you will have some of the difficulties. And I think when you read some of the judgments that have been passed, that is potentially one of the issues there. So I think the regulator has been clear about the standards. They're clear about the, if you like, the de minimis level they expect you to reach, which is what those standards entail. So if you know where you are against those and you're kind of trying to improve and always trying to get better, I think the earlier you start that journey, the better you're going to stand in your stead when the regulation visits then come around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that kind of feeds into what we were discussing, Grant, around your role with Birmingham in terms of sort of being quite heavily involved in those self-assessments and sort of mock inspections. So is there particular reflections or challenges that you guys found at Birmingham when going through that sort of pre-inspection grading process?
There are, yeah. Just to give a little bit of context, so obviously we're still under a breach notice from May 23 relating to the previous standard, so the home standard and the tenant involvement and empowerment standard. So we're still very actively involved with the regulator on a monthly basis. So in a way that's good, because although they don't give you any indications of where they think you'd come out in an inspection, we're getting that kind of real-time feedback from them, and they're really on top of the data. So it's good to see the way that they're kind of approaching us. We did our initial self-assessment was in probably September 23. That one was a very ad hoc internal self-assessment just based on the consumer standards. We didn't really have any great guidance in terms of what an inspection would look like at that time. So it was just kind of trying to assess all of the specific expectations. Where do we think we are against each of those? And then what can we do to improve them? Then we had another self-assessment last year, which was a bit more assisted by Campbell Tickell. And obviously that was a bit more informed by the gradings that had started coming through. And then we'll be having a proper in inverted commas mock inspection from Campbell Tickell later on this year. So I think the two that we've conducted were very different, because the first one, like I said, we didn't really know what we were doing specifically. It was more of a fact finding and an evidence gathering exercise, really, just to see what have we got against these standards and do we think that we're compliant. Last year we had a bit more of an idea of actually what does the inspection look like and where are we going. So I think the reflections are probably, with the internal assessments, I think there's a little bit of a risk of bias. I think maybe in some areas we probably overestimated our readiness and maybe underestimated weaknesses. And I think the good thing with the mock inspection is it highlights where there's a gap between internal perceptions of our kind of preparedness and actually, although it's not an external evaluation, it's that idea of, we're a separate team, we're coming in, we're having a look at things, and we can see where what services think is preparedness isn't actually isn't going to make it. There's operational blind spots that we picked up, so inefficiencies and compliance gaps. Obviously with the S&Q standard it's very easy because it's compliance or not to achieve, whereas with other ones they're a little bit more esoteric. So until you really start looking at the data and drilling down, it's difficult sometimes to pick up on what those operational inefficiencies are. And I think in some areas the reflection is that we've got some good practice. There are pockets of things happening. Not everything's bad. We don't think we're a C4, but there are certainly areas where we're much more prepared than others. And it's about then how do we maintain those good standards and bring the other areas up to it. With challenges, I think resistance to change is one of the big ones that we've experienced. Some of the elements, it's minor tweaks. It's maybe a policy needs refreshing or something, just an approach just needs to be changed a little bit. Some areas there's a lot more large-scale change needed, and that can be difficult operationally, particularly where we're having to maybe procure new systems to implement changes. There's a kind of financial, given Birmingham situation, and an operational resistance to some of those. Time constraints. We we didn't do our mock inspections or our self-assessments over the same time period. We gave ourselves a few weeks to do them, but even doing it that way, going out and gathering evidence from service areas, there was a lot of, we don't have time to keep coming back to you with evidence. So it's about kind of making sure that you're clear on what you're doing and how long it's going to take and what evidence you're going to be asking for. And then I think implementing the feedback. So translating those results once we'd been out and said, here's the specific expectations, here's the evidence we've got, now what do we do with it? And how do we sort of take that forward now that we know where we think we're good, where we're not? And having a kind of robust, what we've done is initialise a sort of task and finish group against each of the separate consumer standards, chaired by someone from a different service area with the right people in the room, and try to take them forward that way rather than trying to take the whole thing on as one piece. You've got to break it down because it is so big.
Yeah. Well, it makes total sense. And I suppose just come back to one of your points there around sort of resistance to change, which makes total sense, to be fair, with, I'm assuming, and sort of specific corporate strategies and strategies in different areas of the organisation in place, and then the new sort of regulatory regime coming along, and therefore having to, I suppose, pivot in certain areas of that. Is that a case that the sort of the findings from the mock inspections and self-assessments sort of ended up having to force you down different routes that maybe the organisation was sort of planning to go on anyway, and then that therefore leads into the sort of time and budget constraints you mentioned?
Yeah, I think so. We kind of knew where we were. So some of it was reinforcing what we already knew we were going to have to do that was maybe long-term planning and needs to be brought forward. Yeah. Some of it was we need to do a complete 180 with what we're doing with this project because it's not going to deliver against the standards, particularly around compliance and recording and being able to evidence. That was the big one that obviously there's no resistance to trying to achieve safety in our housing stock, but how we deliver that and how we record that was the challenge at the beginning.
Would you say from your position then as well, Grant, that obviously from the first batch we saw some of the data that it seemed to be that local authorities were less likely to score higher on the sort of consumer standard gradings and things. Do you think part of that is that it's almost a newer sort of engagement with the regulators, with housing associations themselves being quite used to maybe what the regulators are expecting for the sort of G&V gradings? Do you think that came into play, would you say?
Yeah, I do. I think it was on the radar, but I don't think we were as prepared as we could have been, or as kind of cognizant of it as we could have been. So it was maybe a bit more of a culture shock for us that particularly once we got the specific expectations and we saw how much there was there, that it was like, oh yeah, this is a big piece of work here, and it's not going to be easy to evidence compliance.
Sense. Okay, great stuff. Thanks for that, guys. Just on the, I suppose, inspection insights bit specifically, that when I've seen sort of communication coming out from the regulator around, they are very open and sort of clear that this is quite outcome focused. But I've seen, it is some of this around, similar to the whole sort of method around sort of, I guess, learning and training yourself to pass a GCSE exam versus learning how to sort of pass the inspection sort of tick boxes, or is it more sort of outcome and sort of what's the sort of narrative around that from your experience internally? Maybe yourself first, David.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was always a bit rubbish at exams when I was younger, so I'm not going to profess to be very good at them. But I think what the regulator is really looking for is the outcomes that you're achieving in line with, as I call it, the de minimis that they've laid out. So when you look at those regulatory standards, they contain statements of expectation, is the way I would describe it. So we expect you to do A, B, C, and D. What they never tell you is how to do it, and I think that's right. I think the regulator, at the end of the day, they're not there to tell us what to do. And I think if you worked in different sectors, it's an approach that you could become used to. So I think what they're looking for is very much how are you delivering the outcomes to meet the standards, and then are you clear in your governance terms and your accountability terms about how that is working and how well it is working, and where you've got your weaknesses, is Grant talked about. And I think the key with the weaknesses is that you need to have a plan about what you're doing about them, and you need to show progress. So it's no good talking about, oh, well, we've got a problem with this, and then that kind of being the end of the conversation. So we like a lot of providers have suffered with increased repairs demand, for example. Now, the regulator knows that there is a limit to how much you can do. There's not a bottomless pot of money, but actually, are you being clear about the impact on that? Are you managing vulnerability within those sort of constraints, and then being really clear, because ultimately that is what the driver is about, and more so than ever, what they want to see is that clear through your governance structures. So whether that's a board and a customer committee, involved customers, whatever that looks like. But essentially, I think one of the key takeaways I would give to anyone to think through is, if the regulator was to speak to anyone from one of your boards or one of your committees or involved customer structures, will they hear that point of triangulation? Are you talking about the same challenges and ultimately trying to get to the same outcomes in the same way? And I think if you can make sure that that's embedded in that discussion with executives, with your board structures, through your non-executives and your involved customers, you'll be able to demonstrate that you've actually got things in place and you've got things in control. So I would very much always urge people to not think about this as an exam or trying to hit a scorecard or a benchmark or anything. This is about, in a way, being proud about what you're doing, but being open on the challenges that you've got and being clear about how you're going to address them.
That makes sense. So you would say then that there's particular weighting placed on the likes of governance around this sort of board understanding and I guess, just as you described it, really the sort of the ability to demonstrate understanding and intent around sort of progression.
Yeah, I think it's very much depends on every organisation, because I think obviously one of the things that gets taken into account when you go through the inspection is whether or not you've had any reportable matters, so whether you've self-referred or anything like that. So there will be a degree of variance within every inspection, but at the core of it, ultimately, key operational things under those standards, what they're looking for is that evidence that the committee and the board and the governance structure really understood the challenges and what you were doing about them. So at the end of the day, what the regulator is not going to do is go all the way down, speak to every single member of staff. It's just, that's not feasible. And what they want to see is there that clear triangulation between your governance structures and your executive team, that actually things are in place and things are being undertaken. And ultimately, the size of your organisation will dictate the levels that feels like. So the smaller your organisation, that might feel like they're going through a lot of the organisation, and the bigger you are, it might feel as though they're not going that deep. But ultimately, they want to see and feel those same things, and that comes down to how it flows and how it transports through your governance structures.
That makes sense. What would be your take then on that? Something I mentioned in the intro as part of a little bit of research into this. Now, I've seen the regulator touch on this a few times and sort of allude to it in other areas of regulation generally as well, really. But the fact that, you know, if you achieve C1, that's kind of their bare minimum expectation, really. You know, it's not necessarily a pat on the back. It's you know, this is where you kind of should be. Whereas it does feel a little bit like. And I particularly think that, you know, organisations that achieve that high grading is a good demonstration, obviously, of sort of high performance against it. But it almost feels like a little bit of a celebration when an organisation gets to that C1, and it's seen as obviously a positive thing. But the regulator sees that as, you know, no, this is just bare minimum. You should, in honesty, be doing sort of over and above. What's your take on that?
This might be controversial. I don't know. People will have their own views. I kind of agree with the regulator. Yeah. So what the regulator has laid out in standards is I say, is that minimum that they expect you to do. I think if you go through those with a fine-tooth comb, there's nothing that I don't think anyone in the street would expect you not to deliver as a housing provider. And I think what gets overlooked is not necessarily the way that the level of detail that's described in the standards, but actually it's about taking those standards, meeting them at a very sort of biennial basic level, but then actually how are you delighting and enhancing your customer experience thereafter? Because any inspection is only a moment in time. It's like an exam. It's what you want that bit, and actually by and large, that won't stand up for a customer who's got a complaint, who's unhappy with service failure, because ultimately what they're bothered about is what's happening in that moment. So I agree with the regulator. What we've got is a minimum benchmark that we need to aim for. But I think as time moves on, what we all need to focus on is are we delivering the services in a way that really matter to our customers? And I think that is where the difference comes, in that if you're doing that and you're doing that consistently well, your customers will be saying the right things, and then actually your challenges around things like regulation, the housing ombudsman that people talk about now, will start to dissipate in a way, and it'll become like business as usual. So I think we as a sector have got a little bit of balancing to do, it feels like, on that front, because we'll talk a lot about the regulatory standards and the ombudsman, but the sooner we get to a point where we're really focusing on what we all individually need as organisations to delight our customers in line with what we need to do, I think the better for everyone.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And with that sort of point you mentioned, which I think is I definitely agree with, and I suppose part of, you could kind of say that about CSMs in some ways as well, that, you know, when those surveys are generated and that sort of satisfaction level is sort of ascertained from customers, that again is sort of a point in time for that particular customer's opinion of service delivery and satisfaction. Have you seen from your experience much sort of correlation between CSM results and then subsequently the consumer grading itself, in terms of, because obviously part of the downgrades but lower scoring consumer gradings that we've seen, a lot of the issues associated with that are very similar to those that seem to be causing dissatisfaction, which you would expect. But have you seen a bit of a correlation between high performing CSMs and therefore high performing consumer gradings as well?
I can't remember what that quote is, but is it something like statistics and damn lies or something like that? You can get that to tell you anything that you wanted to tell you. And I think there is, from what I've looked at, there's correlation in a multitude of different ways. So you have organisations that have very high TSMs but have actually got a lower consumer grading, vice versa. You have lower TSM scores but high consumer grading. I think in some ways it's probably like trying to look for a unicorn looking for an answer to that question. We all think it exists, but we don't quite know, and no one's ever seen one. So I think I come down on the side of line, which is whether it be the TSMs, whether it be transactional surveys, they are all insights into how people are feeling and interacting with your services. They're an indicator for where you're at. What they are not a substitute for or a correlation to, in my opinion, is actually how well you meet the regulatory standards, because I think the two things are looking at very different elements. So I think as a sector, we will probably see over time different lower consumer grades, higher satisfaction, and a mix of it the other way around as well. And I think that'll just naturally happen, because I think it comes down to that point where actually meeting those consumer standards doesn't necessarily always mean you're fulfilling how great your customers think you should be. And I think that's where you get that breaking of the mold, because actually what you've seen is, I think there was some organisations early on who had really great TSMs but actually were coming out at C2 and C3. So you can see the argument in both ways. So I think what we're going to do is step back, think as individual organisations, what do these data points really tell us? And are we doing the right things for our customers? And are we meeting the de minimis that the regulator has set for us?
Yeah. But it feeds back into that point, doesn't it, of satisfying these things, seen as the bare minimum, I suppose, and really it should be sort of going over and above, which kind of makes sense. But onto the sort of evidence collection and data and delivery around this then. Having been through this yourself at 13 months already, now with Stonewater and yourself, Grant, with Birmingham, for those organisations that may be on the call now who are sort of in the phase of sort of evidence gathering and sort of data collection in preparation for self-assessments, but also sort of mock inspections or inspections themselves, is there any sort of advice or learnings that you could sort of touch on today that you've found worked well, and maybe certain things to avoid around that sort of evidence gathering piece?
I think for us, the first time round, we cast the net much too wide. I think we because we weren't clear on what we had out there, which it was a good exercise for us, I think, just kind of organisationally to see what we have. But I think we had folders and folders of evidence against every specific expectation. It helps to kind of shape where you need to go. A lot of things were maybe old, a bit dated, so there were things that needed to be refreshed. But I think second time around, because we've then seen some sort of outcomes from inspections, we were much clearer in terms of we don't need every minutes of every tenant meeting. We need to have a clear structure, show that those meetings are happening, and then where does that go? And I think that's as David was saying, that's where we are at the moment now. Is I think it's about, for us, because we're a local authority, things have to go into cabinet. It's it takes time to get things to cabinet. But it's about making sure that those things are reported, they're visible to our cabinet member to oversight and scrutiny. Less about, do we have millions and millions of documents that the regulator probably doesn't want to see. They'll want assurance that we're doing these things. They might want a sample, but we don't have to show them the last 5 years of meeting notes on a particular topic. So I think it's just being specific rather than being too broad was probably our lesson.
Rather than dropping an enormous book of evidence onto their table and just, there you go, sort of audit that. Yeah. Is that something you'd agree with, David, in terms of your experience?
Oh yeah, totally. I think Grant's spot on. I think in reality, maybe he's going back 2 or 3 cycles maximum. But I think the other thing that I would urge people to think about is if you were on the other side having to read everything that got sent through, because ultimately that's the job of the regulators. Whatever you send, they're going to have to read. And I think by and large, we go through the process where they have the document request beforehand, but that is informed by things that they've researched, what they know from your regulatory returns. And I think the guide that we used was around about sort of 50 to 60 pieces of documentation at that stage. When you start going more than that, then Grant's point kicks in. But it's that bit where, be very aware that whatever you send will get read, and the more you send, the more that's going to get read. So think about being on the other side of that is what I would urge people to think about.
Very good point. From our point of view at Prodo, when we've been through various types of projects, to be honest, whether it be creating some sort of digital platform or even sort of some of the consultancy projects that we run, and there is certain pieces of documentation required to review at that stage. Sometimes that's more difficult than others with organisations, just simply because some of these things are sort of more readily available in certain organisations than others. Did you experience much of that in terms of some of the evidence that you need to put forward as part of this? It was very difficult to sort of pull insights together or get your hands on, just due to the historic sort of nature of our sector being quite legacy in certain processes and sort of formats around this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think, sorry, for me, like I said, but yeah, there's lots of stuff out there that once we started asking for information and we started contacting, there were policies that we didn't know we had that were just out there, particularly kind of housing management operational policies that they're not on our website. Some people say, no, we don't have a policy for that. Then it turns up there is a policy, but it's from 2007 and it's not been updated. So that goes on the list of something to be done. So there is, I suppose it's the unknown unknowns, isn't it? That until you, like I say, although we trawled probably too far, a lot of that data was really useful because it did turn up things that, at least now we know that we do have a policy for decant that's, 20 years old, rather than that coming to light closer to an inspection where we've got less time to address it.
Revealing those areas for improvement earlier, which I suppose, absolutely is part of that initial purpose, I guess. But onto sort of general culture and learning then. Quite a broad question, this one, I suppose, but would you say, either of you, that us sort of operating in the social housing sector, do you think the sector thus far has truly embedded customer insight into decision making, or do you think that's just part of certain parts of decision making still? Do you think these sort of different regulation changes, as and when we progress through them, sort of assist with that?
We've just recently had a new tenant engagement framework again, and we had TPAS in a couple of years ago. We weren't good enough with customer insight or with engagement with tenants or with involving them in decision making process. So we're probably at the beginning of that journey. We're just making those initial steps now. We've relaunched our city housing liaison boards. Now they've got a different name. I can't think what they are now, but they were very localized. They were very demographically not representative of the city. Some areas didn't have them. So that's all been relaunched, and we are trying to embed that now. But yeah, that we're at the very beginning with that really at the moment.
Yeah. What's your take on that, David, in terms of sector-wide, from your experience, is customer insight generally taken across the board in terms of decision-making these days, would you say?
I think everyone's probably in different places. I think there's some places where it's probably working really well, and some places where it's being developed. And I think one of the challenges for me around embedding customer insight is when that insight messes with what you think. I think that is a real sector, and sometimes we've collected data over a multitude of years, and if you've gone through mergers or LSVT, like large scale voluntary transfers, whatever the background is to how the organisation ended up being where it is today, a lot of the data that was collected was probably just collected because it had always been collected. And I think when you're talking about using customer insight to inform decision making, it's about actually what is the question that we're trying to answer, and do we have the data to prove that? Now, I think every organisation will have a raft of data and a wealth of data at its disposal, and in some ways other sectors will be very jealous of the things that we have on record from residents. I think the key is understand what you've got and how you use that as an organisation, and there is no silver bullet for this, and I do genuinely think this is one that differs from organisation to organisation. And whilst we can try and have common data standards between us, how our customers view us and how they react to the decisions we make will differ massively depending on each organisation. So I think, yeah, there's definitely more work for the sector to do on it, to really truly embed that in a way that we would maybe potentially look at other sectors and how they do it. But I definitely think the journey started and in progress is being made on it.
Great stuff. Thanks for that. Just one of the points that we covered earlier around some of the things that are feeding into the gradings that aren't quite reaching C1, and going back to that point about CSMs and things before, some of the things we tend to find that inform dissatisfaction or low levels of satisfaction quite often seem to be housing stock and asset based. Why do you think that is? Do you think we're, as a sector, just better at certain parts than others in terms of assisting tenants with other things that sort of don't feed into asset management and sort of health and safety and repairs and maintenance? Why would you say it tends to be quite often stock and asset based issues that kind of feed into these things as often areas that need to be improved? Again, quite a broad question again for you.
My personal view on it is because sometimes we take a very binary look at a housing association in a housing organisation, in the sense of it has to be this or that. But I think if you dig into things like the TSMs, what you find is that people will either be happy or unhappy because of a multitude of things, and it's a bit like Matrix. And it usually ends up at the door of repairs and assets, because ultimately people are either buying or renting a home from us. That's the crack. That's the deal that we do with every resident. So inevitably it ends up falling down as a cascade that always ends you up at that door. But I think the relative level of happiness and unhappiness that somebody has is usually because of a multitude of things, and some of that will be led from how they've been communicated with, from their initial points of contact all the way through. And some of it will come down to people being genuinely unhappy with the state of their home, and we can't shy away from that. But I think what we've got to start doing as organisations is probably thinking about this in a more holistic way, and actually the residents' views will be formed on their whole interaction with us, whether that is at the very first point when they speak to somebody in a call centre or use an online system, all the way through to that home. And I think the more we can do that as a sector, and the more we can do that as individual organisations, the better it'll stand us in a stead to get really like a compelling value proposition based around the whole entity of a home and all of the services that go on in it.
That makes sense. Any thoughts from yourself on that, Grant, in terms of
Yeah,
authority point of view?
I think, as David said, it sounds trite to say, but yeah, ultimately, everybody's our tenant. So I think, you know, the physical sort of condition of the property is there every day, isn't it? Whereas other, particularly operational housing management things, maybe they're pulled on as and when needed. But yeah, people are in their home 24/7, and I think for us, there's a definite correlation with our TSMs. The reason that we were under breach notice is because of our decency compliance. You know, and there was no getting away from how far from where we should be we were with decency. So I think particularly for us, that is a problem in terms of we knew that a lot of our stock wasn't decent. We didn't really know how much. We weren't clear on that. We've done a lot of work on that in the last couple of years. So we're in a better position to know where we are and where we're going with the investment program and when we'll get to decency. But I think we've had to accept as a landlord that a lot of our tenants are unhappy with the condition of the property, and really because of a lack of investment over the last 10, 15, 20 years, that perception is justified. And although our TSM measures around repairs have improved over the last couple of years, and ombudsman determinations around those are going down because of the work that's gone on, yeah, there's no getting away from us. I think that the biggest driver for our tenants' satisfaction is the condition of their properties and our response to their complaints about it.
That makes total sense. Is there anything, I suppose, from different points of view here again, but yourself, David, having been through with 13 and soon to be sort of complete in that process with Stonewater, and yourself, Grant, from preparing for it, is there anything you could talk about in terms of how the findings from the consumer gradings were being used post-inspection? I suppose after 13 managed to reach the C1, but also, I guess, as you're sort of prepping for Stonewater and prepping for Birmingham, how the findings have been utilised thereafter for sort of post-inspection?
Yeah, we're certainly poring over them as they come in, and trying to gauge where we think we are, particularly where it's sort of peers or neighbouring authorities a few have had there. So we're definitely comparing ourselves to it and use. It's difficult to say how much you can benchmark because obviously the reports aren't so detailed line by line against the expectations that you can definitely gauge where you are. But I think we're definitely trying to use information from those, and then obviously because we're working with Campbell to Kellen, that they're working with a lot of authorities going through it, that they're very helpful in terms of benchmarking or in terms of the data behind the data, maybe that informs where we're going with our task and finish groups and with our activities. So yeah, we're definitely using it, but we're also heads down in our own action plans, trying to get to where we need to be with those.
That makes sense. What from your point of view, David, having sort of been through and achieved that C1 at 13?
Yeah, no, it's very similar. I think obviously there's as the months roll by, more and more reports get published by the inspector in terms of their finding, their inspections. And I think there was some published just yesterday. And I think it's a bit like your TSMs, your transactional satisfaction. I think they're all a great source of information, but they're not going to give you any silver bullet answers. And as Grant says, all of the inspection reports, they follow pretty much a standard template, and they're done at a very limited level if you want to delve into them. So I think what the main thing that you have to do when you see those is then tailor that and think, well, actually, where are we with regards to our journey with some of those things? So if there is a C3 or a C4, reading those and understanding what went wrong, but then assuring yourself that you've not got that issue, or you're doing something about it if you do have a similar issue. And then equally on the ones and the twos, looking at what people are doing really well and thinking, well, where are we on a gauge of that? And I think, as I say, you're not going to get any answers in them, but I think it's about taking the learnings from them and using that to then modify your organizational strategy, your customer service strategy, your home strategy, however it's written, and then ultimately the plans that you're working on day in, day out. Because ultimately becoming C1 in staying there are two different things. And it's also a third different thing to continuously keep the majority of your customers happy. And I think to do those three things, you need to be continuously evolving and learning and then developing services and pushing your services into a space where it might at first be uncomfortable, but if it's what your customers really want and will really deliver for them, that's going to be good for everyone in the round.
Just as we sort of approach the end, I suppose, if anyone does have any questions, I don't think we've had any through just yet, do feel free to pop them in the chat and we can address them very soon. But yeah, I suppose as we do sort of come towards the end, guys, a couple, I suppose, around reflection and I guess advice in some ways as well. Is there anything that you'd say, I guess, firstly, sort of surprised you around the first sort of batch of released outcomes in terms of gradings and things? But I suppose linked to that, is there anything that you think is generally being misunderstood or overcomplicated across this from a consumer standards perspective that either of you've got any thoughts on? Or did it sort of play out as you expected in terms of the sort of the quite broad gradings from C1 to C4?
I think for me, Jake, I think what has potentially been misunderstood or overcomplicated is just the role of regulation. And I think not from the regulator's point of view, I think they've been very clear about it in terms of how the standards have a role to play in the sector. But I think the misunderstanding, the overcomplication comes from actually what is the regulator trying to achieve. So I think as time goes by, I think that will get a bit easier. And I think sort of it goes back to where we were earlier. My thoughts on it, my advice to anyone thinking about it is not to see it as a big, scary thing. It's to see it as actually preparation for evidence and how great the things are that we all do as a sector. And I think we've got very used to the governance and the financial viability approach and the self-assessments and continuously doing things like stress testing. This is just the consumer version of those elements. And I think the more we're talking, the more we're evidencing what we're doing, then the easier it becomes. And I think as time goes by, I think that will settle down and that will become clearer for everyone. And ultimately, I think none of us should shy away from having regulation within the sector, because I think it is one of the things that makes the sector very, very attractive, both to customers, but then to wider institutions like your banks and your lenders, because actually there is a standard to be delivered, to be attained, and we'll all have our challenges on that journey, and we'll all have things that we've got to grapple with as we go through it. But I think, yeah, just seeing it as part of what we do will help with that.
Thanks for that, David. What about yourself, Grant?
Yeah, I don't think there was anything. I don't think we've seen any shocking assessments. I don't think there's anything that we've thought that we weren't expecting. I suppose that probably, if anything, it's the amount of authorities and landlords that are actually achieving higher than I think we thought. I think certainly from a local authority perspective, I think we felt that it would track towards the kind of lower end, which I know it generally is when compared to housing associations. But I think maybe we were a little bit over pessimistic in terms of where we are, and now that we've seen some outcomes, I think maybe we can sort of recalibrate where we think we are based on the reports. And I don't think there's anything shocking in there, but yeah, it just needs to inform what we're doing, and hopefully some of them do reinforce that sounds like where we are, or that sounds like where we're trying to get to. So I don't think there's anything surprising in what we've seen so far. No.
Great stuff. That makes sense. Brilliant. Well, thanks for that, guys. We haven't had any sort of new questions through, so that's probably quite a good point to wrap up, I guess. So just wanted to thank you both again for taking the time to join us today. It was a really interesting discussion, certainly with the sort of different perspectives from you both around sort of, David, you've sort of been through it once yourself already, and again since, and Grant sort of going through it from a local authority point of view, which maybe feels a little bit newer compared to sort of dealing with the regulator compared to sort of housing association. So that was a really interesting one. Thank you very much for that. I think the sort of the takeaways for me around this discussion was around that, that sort of preparation and self-assessment, mock inspections piece is critical. It's not a case of sort of waiting to be inspected to understand the gaps. It's sort of preparation, and that's sort of what the regulator's been quite clear on, seeing as certainly a positive, but also feeds into generally sort of how that process can change in terms of improvements and generally sort of transparency anyway across the board, really. So hopefully you guys on the call took something from today from the guys as well. Just before we do wrap up for the day, just quickly, we do have another Housing Hive session scheduled for next month, 26th of June, same time, last Thursday of the month at 11 o'clock. On the sort of a similar sort of topic, I suppose, preparing and sort of acting upon regulatory or legislative changes. I guess we're going to be talking about the fact that we're only 4 months away now from the implementation of ARB's law, and kind of exploring what this means for housing providers in practice, with some senior housing professional panelists on board with us again as well. So look out for that one. We'll release more information on who'll be joining us as and when. But yeah, big thanks to you two guys again for taking the time to join us. Much appreciated. And thanks for everyone else who joined the call today. Hopefully that was worthwhile for you all. We will record the session and pop it up on a YouTube, so look out for those. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you on the next one. Thanks again, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Cheers, David. Cheers, Grant.